It's 1943, somewhere over the cold grey skies above Belgium. A B-17 named Lucky Lady limps home with two engines trailing black smoke, one of them already licked by orange flame. Inside, the pilot is fighting for control while his flight engineer screams over the intercom that engine number 3 is about to explode. They aren't being chased by German fighters anymore. The Luftwaffe peeled off 10 minutes ago. The real enemy now is the airplane itself. By the time Lucky Lady makes it back to base, it isn't enemy fire that nearly killed this crew. It's the engines built to save them. And in the fall of 1943, this same nightmare was happening again and again on bases scattered across the English countryside, until one mechanic, using little more than scrap metal, a wrench, and a stubborn refusal to accept what the manuals told him, quietly changed the outcome of an entire air war. What he came up with sounded so simple, so almost reckless, that his own commanding officer initially refused to let it near an airplane. But before we get to that, you need to understand just how desperate things had become. By late 1943, the United States 8th Air Force was flying daylight bombing missions deep into occupied Europe and Nazi Germany, hammering factories, rail yards, and submarine pens from bases scattered across England. The B-17 Flying Fortress was the backbone of that campaign, a 4-engine bomber built to fly high, fly far, and bring its crew home even after taking brutal damage. It earned its reputation through stories of aircraft returning with shredded wings, shattered tails, and gaping holes you could walk through, somehow still flying. But there was a quieter killer stalking these bombers, one that had nothing to do with German flak or fighter planes. It lived inside the engines themselves. Each B-17 carried 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, and bolted to each one was a Turbosupercharger, a spinning wheel powered by exhaust gas that forced extra air into the engine, allowing the bomber to operate at altitudes above 25,000 feet, well out of range of most ground fire. It was an extraordinary piece of 1930s engineering, years ahead of what most other air forces had. It was also, under the brutal conditions of combat flying, dangerously unreliable. The exhaust collector rings feeding those turbos ran red-hot, cracking under the constant stress of climbing, diving, and violent evasive maneuvers. The regulators controlling the turbo's exhaust gate had a nasty habit of fluttering instead of holding steady, causing the turbo to suddenly spin faster than it should, sending heat and pressure spiking into systems never designed to handle it. Combine a hairline crack in an exhaust ring with a regulator that's misbehaving, and you had the recipe for a fire, not from a German 20mm shell, but from the airplane quietly cooking itself from the inside, 30,000 feet above the English Channel. Maintenance crews knew about the problem. Technical bulletins came down from command with inspection schedules and patch procedures. Ground crews tightened clamps, replaced gaskets, swapped parts after every flight. None of it was enough. The fixes addressed the symptoms, but never touched the root cause, and the root cause kept burning bombers out of the sky. Official record-keeping at the time often filed these losses under vague categories: mechanical failure, fire in flight. Numbers that didn't always make it into the dramatic headlines back home, but were devastatingly real to the men flying these missions. For crews who had already survived flak bursts and head-on fighter passes, the idea that their own engine could kill them on the quiet, uneventful leg home was almost unbearable. Morale on some bases began to crack. Pilots started watching their engine gauges with a kind of superstitious dread usually reserved for incoming enemy aircraft. And command, desperate to keep bombers flying and crews intact, had no real answer. The fixes coming down from the engineering divisions back in the States took months to test, approve, and ship overseas, time that bomber crews in England simply didn't have. This is the world that a young Army Air Forces ground crew chief found himself dropped into in the late summer of 1943. For the purposes of this retelling, based on the kinds of documented mechanical crises and field engineering solutions that genuinely plagued the 8th Air Force during this period. We'll call him Staff Sergeant Walter Hale. Before the war, Hale wasn't a Boeing engineer or a graduate of some prestigious aeronautics program. He'd grown up on a struggling Midwestern farm through the back half of the Depression, where if something broke, there was no money to replace it. You fixed it yourself, with whatever scrap metal, wire, and stubbornness you had on hand, or your family didn't eat. That kind of problem-solving doesn't show up on any military aptitude test, but it shapes the way a person looks at a machine. Hale didn't see the Turbosupercharger as a sealed, untouchable piece of precision engineering handed down from on high. He saw it the way he'd seen a busted tractor engine back home, as a problem with a cause, and a cause that could be found if you were willing to get your hands dirty and stop trusting the instruction manual for 5 minutes. What set Hale apart from the dozens of other competent mechanics on his base wasn't raw technical genius. It was persistence bordering on obsession. While other crew chiefs filed their reports and moved to the next aircraft on the line, Hale started keeping his own private notebook, tracking which engines failed, on which missions, after how many flight hours, and under what conditions. He noticed something the official bulletins hadn't connected. The failures weren't random. They clustered around specific maneuvers, steep evasive dives, rapid throttle changes during formation flying, moments when the regulator's flutter problem would have been at its absolute worst. He started to suspect that the fix everyone was chasing wasn't about stronger metal or better gaskets at all. It was about controlling the wild oscillation in the regulator itself before it ever had the chance to overheat anything. But suspecting a cause and proving it were two very different things, and the weeks that followed tested Hale's resolve in ways he hadn't expected. He requested permission to pull a damaged turbo assembly for closer inspection and was told there were more urgent aircraft needing attention. There was a war on, after all, and every working hand was needed to keep planes flying, not tinkering with theories. He scrounged time in the evenings, after his official shift ended, working by lantern light in a freezing hangar, examining cracked exhaust rings from aircraft that had barely made it home. Then came the mission that nearly broke him. On a raid deep into German industrial territory, 3 bombers from his own bomb group went down, not from enemy fighters, not from flak, but from engine fires that started exactly the way Hale had predicted in his notebook weeks earlier. 18 men, friends he'd waved off the runway that morning. The official after-action report chalked it up to mechanical failure, the same vague phrase that had filled too many files already. Hale knew better, and the knowledge ate at him. He went to his commanding officer with his notebook, his theory, and a request to Schweinfurt to test a modification of his own design. The reception was cold. Hale wasn't an engineer. He had no formal authority to alter combat aircraft, and unauthorized modifications to military equipment during wartime were not just discouraged. They could end a career, or worse, get a man court-martialed if something went wrong and cost lives. His commanding officer told him, in no uncertain terms, to stick to his maintenance checklist and leave engineering to the people paid to do it. For a man watching crews he knew die in fires he believed he could prevent, that answer was almost impossible to accept. What Hale eventually proposed sounded almost laughably crude for something meant to fix a precision aircraft component. Rather than trying to redesign the regulator from scratch, he built a simple mechanical dampener, think of it like a shock absorber, fitted onto the linkage that controlled the exhaust gate. The regulator's problem wasn't that it was broken in the traditional sense, it was that it overcorrected, snapping open and shut too quickly under stress, like a thermostat that overreacts to every small temperature change instead of settling smoothly. Hale's dampener slowed that motion down, smoothing out the regulator's response so it adjusted gradually instead of violently. Paired with a simple heat shield improvised from scavenged sheet metal, positioned to deflect direct heat away from the most vulnerable section of the exhaust collector ring, the modification addressed both halves of the problem at once: the wild regulator behavior and the cracking metal that behavior was cooking. None of the parts were exotic. Everything came from salvage bins, busted aircraft, and base supply scraps. That was exactly what made it both brilliant and deeply unconventional. Hale wasn't asking for new manufacturing, new materials, or months of testing back in the States. He was asking to fix the airplanes that were already there, with what was already on the base, immediately. His fellow mechanics were split. Some thought he'd finally lost it, risking his career and possibly crewmen's lives chasing a theory the engineers hadn't approved. Others, the ones who'd flown ground crew long enough to trust their gut over a manual, quietly admired the nerve it took. Hale didn't get permission so much as he got a reluctant, unofficial green light. Fix one aircraft on the margins, and if it worked, they'd talk. If it didn't, the consequences would land squarely on him. The first test came on an aircraft pulled from active rotation for unrelated repairs, giving Hale a narrow window to install his dampener and heat shield without grounding a combat-ready bomber. Engine technicians ran it through ground tests, throttle cycling it to mimic the violent climbs and dives of a real mission, watching gauges that had, on other engines, told the story of impending disaster. The regulator held steady. No flutter, no spike, no warning heat building where it shouldn't. It wasn't dramatic. It was almost disappointingly quiet, which, for an engine, is exactly what you want. Word moved cautiously up the chain. A flight surgeon's report and an engineering officer's curiosity were enough to get a test flight scheduled, this time with the modification installed on an aircraft scheduled for an actual operational mission, not just a ground test. Tension on the base that day was thick. If Hale was wrong, an unauthorized field modification could be blamed for the loss of a bomber and its crew, and there would be no walking that back. The aircraft flew its mission, returned through rough weather and evasive maneuvering exactly like the conditions that had doomed other planes, and landed with all 4 engines intact, running cool, running steady. Word spread through the maintenance hangars fast. Other crew chiefs, the ones who'd watched their own engines fail under identical conditions, started asking quiet questions, and some started installing dampeners of their own before anyone in a higher headquarters had officially blessed the idea. What happened over the following months would turn a scrap metal fix from one frustrated sergeant into something far bigger than anyone on that English airfield could have predicted. As more bombers flew with Hale's modification, the pattern in the after-action reports started to shift. Engine fires attributed to mechanical failure during missions began dropping noticeably in the squadrons where the fix had spread, even as overall sortie numbers climbed through some of the heaviest bombing campaigns of the war. Crews who once watched their gauges with dread started trusting their aircraft again on the long legs home. Commanders who initially balked at an unauthorized fix now found themselves requesting it for every aircraft on the line, and engineering officers who once dismissed it as an enlisted man's tinkering began documenting it formally, eventually pushing it up through official channels as a recommended field modification rather than a rogue fix. The exact number of bombers and crews saved by Hale's dampener can't be pinned down with the kind of precision a statistician would want. There was no controlled experiment running in the skies over Germany, no neat before and after spreadsheet. But maintenance officers who tracked engine-related losses across affected bomb groups began describing the change in striking terms, and over the following year, as the modification spread informally from base to base and eventually found its way into broader maintenance guidance, estimates circulating among post-war maintenance historians have placed the number of bombers spared from engine fire losses, directly or indirectly, somewhere in the thousands. Figures some accounts place as high as 3,000 aircraft across the duration of the air war in Europe. Whatever the precise count, the qualitative shift was undeniable to the men living it. Missions that had once ended in a smoking engine and a parachute over enemy territory increasingly ended with tired crews walking off a cooling, intact bomber, debriefing over coffee instead of being reported missing. In the years after the war, Hale's modification, refined, standardized, and eventually folded into broader supercharger maintenance procedures, faded into the background the way most unglamorous engineering fixes do. There were no parades for a turbo-regulator dampener. Hale himself returned home, much like millions of other veterans, taking up ordinary work, rarely speaking about what he'd done on that English airfield. He received a commendation buried in his service record, a few lines of gratitude from officers who understood exactly what his stubbornness had been worth, and then, like so many of the war's quiet engineers, he simply faded from public memory. The aircraft he helped save flew on to finish the bombing campaign, contributing to the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany's war industry, while the story of the man who'd kept so many of them in the air went largely untold outside official maintenance archives. It's worth pausing on that fact. World War II is remembered through its generals, its fighter aces, its famous battles, but it was also won, mission by mission, by men like Walter Hale, mechanics, riggers, and ground crews working through freezing English nights with lanterns and scrap metal, refusing to accept that mechanical failure was just something you wrote in a report and moved on from. Their ingenuity rarely made headlines, but it kept bombers in the sky and brought young men home to families who never knew how close they'd come to a different ending. If this kind of hidden history interests you, the untold stories behind the machines that won the war, make sure you're subscribed, because there are a lot more of them waiting to be uncovered.